And so, not allowing yourself to be afraid in some sense, not letting yourself, let fear dictate to you that, I can't do that, or I really need to stay here where it's safe. I would, strongly suggest people just measure that, think about it.
Step into the world of success with your brand amplified, the ultimate podcast designed to unravel the intricacies of thriving businesses. I'm your host, Annika Jackson, and I'm on a mission to uncover the stories, strategies, and secrets that have propelled entrepreneurs and business leaders to success. As soon as I heard about Scott Marcello, I knew that we had to have a conversation on this podcast, and hopefully many more after. Scott, your work with nonprofit African Mission Healthcare is amazing. I'm really excited to dive into that. I had mentioned via email that I have work that I do in Ghana, helping kids who wouldn't have a chance to have an education, who don't have a safe place to live, and then providing, fundraising opportunities for organic farming for our partner there. So I'm very aligned with you on so many things. And
Great.
This world is all about seeing what we can do to improve the lives of others, isn't it?
I totally agree, Annika. Yes. So I'm excited for the conversation as well, and excited. Maybe you can tell me a little bit more about your work in Ghana at some point. I'd love to hear about it. So
Definitely. Well, I want to take a step backwards. You have an undergrad and a master's in accounting. You worked in corporate for a very long time. Did you know that you always wanted to be in corporate versus an entrepreneurship path?
I didn't. When I went to university, I was the first person to ever go to college in my family.
Amazing.
And I was looking for a way to get a job, to be quite frank. And so I ended up at a university, which I love dearly, Stetson, a small school in DeLand, Florida. And accounting was the number one program that they offered. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to be an accounting major. And it was no more sophisticated than that at the time. And so when I graduated, it was the normal course. At that time, it was the Big Eight to go into a big firm, get some experience. I actually believed I was going to go on and become a lawyer. I wanted to go and study corporate law. And then I decided, after I started doing what I was doing in public accounting, I actually enjoyed it a lot. In some ways, it was the best of all worlds for me because it allowed me to be innovative, to get to know my clients really well. I was very curious about how businesses operate and work, what it took to be successful. I loved learning about leadership. And I was quickly exposed to some really outstanding professionals and outstanding people. So I really loved what I was doing. And that's how I ended up there. And I stayed in public accounting for 31 years before I left and joined AMH. So,
Well, I applaud you for, first of all, being the first person in your family to graduate from university, deciding accounting was your path, but then also not having that feeling that a lot of people get when they go into corporate roles of, this is not my passion, this is not where I'm supposed to be, but really embracing it, realizing this is something that you loved, and then being able to say, all right, now is my time to do something different. So how did you become involved with the African Mission Healthcare?
That's a great question because it was in some ways an accident. Back in 2006, my wife went on it was actually a mission trip to visit a operation in Kajabe, Kenya. And the reason she went was we were very interested in HIV AIDS at the time. And that was a time when in Africa, it was rampant. There were over 4 million people in Kenya alone suffering with HIV. And what was going to be the future for those people and for care was just really uncertain. She went and came back and said, "You really need to go." So the next year, I took a week. I went, I visited, and I met who is now a close friend and my colleague and co-founder of African Mission Healthcare, John Fielder. He is an internal medicine doctor. He graduated from Johns Hopkins, and rather than pursuing a career in the U.S. where he could have made a lot of money, he decided to go and serve people who were less fortunate than him. He ended up in Kenya and was plopped down right in the middle of the HIV crisis. And so I was moved by that and several of his colleagues. And that's why I first became associated. At that point, AMH wasn't even an organization. It was just John and HIV Care. And then in 2010, it was formed as a formal organization. And John and his co-founder, a person named Mark Gerson, who is also very interesting, asked me, would you join the board? And that's how I first became associated with the organization.
Yeah. And they get you into the board, you fall more and more in love with the organization, and then all of a sudden, here you are.
Exactly. Exactly. It's a fascinating place, everywhere. Of course, I'm very biased, but what I love about AMH is it works in the mission hospital field, but it does it largely because it is the most effective place for return on investment, the way we look at it. Our other co-founder, Mark Gerson, he's actually a Jewish entrepreneur, very successful, got to know John in undergrad at Williams College. And when he learned about John's work, he really was passionate about, well, how do I invest? The way he thinks of philanthropy isn't it's just giving away money, it's investing. And how do I invest in the work you're doing? And he quickly learned that what John was focused on had incredible returns. And that's what attracted me to AMH as well. It was both a desire to help people, which, as you said, that's really where it all happens, right? That's why we should be around. That's what we should be doing. But it was also about building an organization that could maximize impact for the donors that were supporting it. And Mark is an ROI guy. That's, how he makes his living, how he ended up with the wealth that he has. And he wanted philanthropy to be the same thing. How do I help the stranger and have the biggest impact I possibly can have? And that was an awesome experience for me to see it happen.
Yeah.
And then when I had a chance to actually get involved in AMH directly, to really be part of making it even stronger. So,
yeah. Well, and you just answered several of my questions, I think.
Sorry about that.
No, not at all. Not at all. Because I was going to say a lot of people approach nonprofits. They don't realize it is still a business. It's just a different tax designation. You still have to treat it as a business. You still have to show proof of concept that you're actually making an impact, because otherwise donors won't feel like you're being intentional. They won't feel like they can trust your organization, right? They don't feel transparency, and they don't see that they are helping really change lives.
Right. Absolutely. And I would also say that in some ways it's more difficult than a business, because if you focus on what you see the most, which is need, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
And you can't build a strategy around need, because you would be pursuing everything basically that moved, right, as far as the needs that are out there. And so what I quickly learned when I came on full time was one of the biggest opportunities was to really craft a vision, a mission, a set of distinctives, and a positioning that really would allow us to make hard decisions, that would allow us to optimize impact, meet need, but also not be chasing simply everything because the need was there, but really stay true to what we were good at. And that's fun in a not-for-profit, but it's so essential, right? Because as you know, you can totally get distracted by every opportunity if you don't really have a good compass about where you're heading and why you're there. So
100%. Or if you have the donor who wants to donate, but they have restricted funds, and they're adding something completely different to your programming. I found with my small nonprofit, Learn, Grow, Lead, we partner with a nonprofit that is official in Ghana, Children Helpers Foundation. And we're a very small group, all volunteers. All of us have had full-time jobs. We have kids. We have, we can't just run and jump right into the work as much as we would love to just dedicate our lives to that. But working with an overseas partner, we found we needed to make sure there was transparency on their part. We needed to start small. So we just started with education, because for us, it's nothing but, the GDP in countries and a lot of other places, $40 or $125 for a kid to go to school for a year and have their textbooks and uniforms and everything else they need is a lot of money for families.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, not to mention, because of things like the AIDS crisis, a lot of families have been disrupted. Maybe they have one parent, maybe both, they've been abandoned to grandparents or other family members, or just on the street.
Right. Absolutely. And I will say, it's interesting that you came to that conclusion. One of my very favorite people is a doctor and his wife that serve in rural Kenya. And his wife is very involved with an orphanage there. And what she quickly learned was the only real impact she could have was helping the kids get an education, because she found when she tried to help them with clothing or with food, the community was just as poor as they were. And so the kids would end up getting this stuff, and the community would end up saying, well, we need it just as badly as you. And so what she intended for the kids really wouldn't make it to them or really benefit them much. But she started really focusing on their education, on getting them through primary school, and then, getting them through their Form 4s and then into university. And now she has several kids that are graduated that are lawyers and doctors, and what a legacy they're going to leave, right? Because now their life, their whole trajectory has changed. So I couldn't agree more with what you said. And healthcare is very similar in my mind. If you think about what keeps people from moving forward, you can boil it down to some basic things, but two of them are lack of education or access to education, and then lack of healthcare. If you're a poor person living on the edge of poverty every day and you break your leg, or if the mother has an injury giving birth, their whole life is really disrupted to the point of they lose everything they might have saved, whether it's a goat or whatever it is that they have of value, and they can't care for their family and they can't be a valued member of the community. And so in my mind, if we can fix those things or help change the trajectory of those things, healthcare, education, personal security, those things have a lasting impact in this context in Africa, I think. And that's why we're so focused on it, quite frankly. So
yeah, I could not agree with you more. Healthcare and education are two big areas that I really love to focus on. I want to understand a little bit more about, so there were these service projects, right? Not an official 501c, then it became one. What is it like working that construct? Is there 501c3 status in the United States and then also a status in Kenya and other countries that you work in? How did you go from one project to figure out what the model was going to be and then to create scale?
Right. So I'll start with the more simple answer to your question, which is yes, we are a 501c3 in the US. And then we're registered with the Kenyan Revenue Authority as a nonprofit, an NGO in Kenya. And not all of our projects pass through Kenya. We have, I would say about 70% of them go through our Kenya operations. And then there are some that go directly from the US, largely because the movement of currency through Kenya and then into, for example, Kwacha in Malawi becomes quite cumbersome. It actually causes more cost and more inefficiency. And so we had to navigate what are the best ways to do that. We're also establishing a presence in Uganda because that is one of the places we're working very heavily right now. We're really focused on maternal child health in Uganda because it's an area of great opportunity. And so we are also, Sudan is another place. We have one of our major hospital projects is in what's called the Nuba Mountains in Sudan. And so we're also looking at a presence there as well. How we morphed was really, we started with the idea that there were these institutions that had individuals and institutional capacity to really grow and be an integral part of the health system. And what I love about our approach is we kind of start in the center. And what I mean by that is we look at the institutions and we say, are they the kind of place where we can comfortably invest and have a lasting impact? And do they value what we value? We came up with 5 distinctives. They were long-term, we're listeners. And when I say listeners, we're active listeners. It doesn't mean you just tell us what you want and we give it to you. It means we're really engaged. We're all about training because we think training is a really big amplifier in this setting. We're really focused on results. And ultimately, we want to bring all these distinctives together with partners that actually value what we value. And so we really started going to the right places and then asking the question, almost like a private equity investor, what would really make the difference in this institution to allow it to serve more people and help strengthen the system? Because we actually saw that a lot of the money being poured into the governments that are moving down into the health systems really weren't being effective. So we said, how do we work from the ground up? How do we work with these hospitals that are really good at what they do and help them become training centers, help them care for more patients, and help them build the system around them? And that's really the model we started using. It's very relationship driven. We really focus on building strong relationships, setting expectations together, and then bringing resources. And so we replicated that model. So now we have 31 hospital partners, 11 countries that we're operating in. We've got a team of about 47 really talented people, most of which are in Kenya. 37 of them are in Kenya or in Uganda or in some of these other locations, with a focus on how do we build those institutions with the eye toward the person on the one side and the system on the other side, and strengthen all of that at the same time. So,
Yeah, that's fantastic. I appreciate the approach of not just going in and being a savior, but actually figuring out what is being effective on the ground, what really needs to happen, and how do we do this together? We're co-creating something with
right.
people who are in the community. We're really listening to what their needs are. Because a lot of times, of course, you hear that people just go into a country and do what we think is appropriate, but we're not necessarily doing the right thing. I can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, it's funny. We like to say we work with 31 mission hospitals right now. And when you've served one, basically, because there is a lot of learning that we can help transfer, because a lot of the times our partners, which is how we think of our hospitals or our partners, are isolated, right? They don't see the broad range of things, but at the same time, they're proximate. They're on the ground. They're living day to day. No one knows their problems or some of the solutions better than they do. What we want to do is help refine them, help them get stronger by seeing things even more broadly, and then helping bring the right resources at the right time. That's fun. It's also very challenging. We find it to be really hard work because you really have to spend time with each of them. It's like a personal relationship. You have to learn the organization, learn what they value, learn what really works for them, what some of their challenges are. You have to gain trust because you have to push back. I can't just walk into Annika and say, hey, Annika, what you really need to do is X and Y, unless she really starts to believe that I care about her as as a person and an institution, and really understand where she's coming from. Well, now I can do something differently, right? And so that's the way we think of this, is we really have to invest that time and energy on the ground. So,
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. I want to also learn a little bit about transferable skills from the world of business and accounting and being at the same organization for your corporate career, and what did transfer really effectively over into the nonprofit world versus what was kind of something that was a surprise for you.
right. Well, one, I love to learn, and I have learned a lot since I joined African Mission Healthcare. So I don't want to suggest that, oh boy, that 30 plus years prepared me for everything possible. On the other hand, I was amazed at how much of it was transferable, because there's a lot about learning about how organizations work, about problem solving, about team building, about empowerment and motivation, about things you really have to exercise if you're going to help lead a corporate organization, that do transfer into not-for-profit. And many times those are the skills that are least available to not-for-profits, to begin with. So when I came to AMH, they didn't need anybody to tell them more about healthcare. I mean, John Fielder is an expert in the area of healthcare, and in particular in Africa. My colleague, Jonathan Windy, who's my executive vice president on our team, he has a PhD in public health and then, public policy around health. So we had plenty of people. We have other physicians working for us. We have clinical people that you would consider to be like physician assistants, whole range of people that really understand the healthcare sphere. I had to learn a lot of that because that's not my background, but they didn't know a lot about organizational construct, or, how do you build an operating model, or how do you think about a strategic position in a marketplace, and how do you preserve it, and how do you make sure you're really staying true to it. So I could bring those things that they didn't have, and I could learn a lot from them, from the things that they had already developed. I was also very fortunate. I walked into an environment where they had never documented a vision or a mission or their distinctives, but they absolutely existed. There's times when you're in an organization and they have one, and you look at it and say, that's not really who you are. This was the exact opposite. They hadn't really written it down, but you could actually discover it, and it was real. It was very genuine, right? They really knew what their mission was. They really knew what their vision should be and what it was. They really knew what made them different, and they weren't just words on a page. And so it was actually one, I had spent a lot of time helping advise really large companies, and I was almost amazed that they were better at aligning who they really were with what they wanted to be than almost organization I had worked for or with. And so in that sense, I was really very fortunate.
Let's move on to donors. I find that sometimes US donors are reluctant to do work overseas because they will say there's so much need over here, or they don't have a tie to that country and they want to work, overseas with a population that looks like them or that they have some other kinship with. So it seems like you did have a base, like a really strong base, especially if you're working through missions and church services. But I want to hear a little bit more about that. Do you get big corporate donors? Do you get a lot of passionate individuals? And how do you overcome some of those challenges that we all face when we're telling our stories, and we know these are things that are not going away. There's always going to be, like you said earlier, there's always going to be need, right?
Right.
So one-time donation isn't going to solve everything. And sometimes people get tired when we ask them again and again.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot packed into there.
Yes.
So I'll take a couple pieces at a time. One, we are really heavily dependent on individuals, although we do have some large corporate foundations. For example, UBS Optimus is a very significant supporter of some of our work. Actually, the churches, part of the reason we existed or we came into existence was a lot of the church support for these hospitals had waned quite a bit over time. They moved their direction into other areas of focus. And so a lot of these hospitals were, in my words, kind of stranded. They had some really good missionary workers, but a lot of the financial support had really shrunk quite a bit. And that's what attracted us to it, was that we saw this pent up opportunity to invest, that there was this really good network of hospitals, really strong foundational people. They had already trained some great African physicians and other medical workers, and they really were anxious to do even more of that. And so with almost, very small investments, relatively speaking, could have a big impact. You're right. Absolutely. You hear a lot, well, why Africa? There's plenty of need here. And I approach that, you got to know your audience, right? So not every donor is going to respond to Africa at all. And then not everyone's going to be persuaded by the same messaging. But I look at it in a couple of buckets. One is, yeah, there's needs here, but need is relative. And when you go to these settings, need there is off the charts bigger and more severe than what you can imagine here. I mean, imagine a woman needing a C-section and having to get on a small moped motorcycle and ride for 8 hours, not sure how she's going to pay for the transportation, let alone the C-section, to save her own life and the baby's life. That is not atypical. That's pretty common in the setting that we work in. I don't see that very often in the US. So I try to help people see, you're right, there's need. And by the way, there's plenty of good things to do in the US. If that's what you're doing and that's your passion, I respect that. But relatively speaking, the needs we're talking about here are much bigger and much more severe. But even beyond that, Africa is a really important place, I think, to invest in. It's the fastest growing place in the world. Over 25% of the people will live there by 2050. It is the youngest population in the world. Uganda, the average age is under 18. And it has the largest healthcare deficit of any place on the planet. There's 24% of the disease exists in Africa. Only 3% of the health workers in the entire planet are in Africa. So that alone tells you there's this big gap. There's an estimate by the WHO that 288 million people today need surgery in Africa and don't have access to it. So, that's almost the population of the United States. It's getting close to 70 or 80% of the US population needing surgery on a continent and not being able to get to it. And I look at it like, yes, there's the personal aspect of I want to care for people in need, and that motivates me. But even if you don't care about that, even if you just care about global stability, the global economy, do you want 25% of the people in the world living in a place where they can't get basic health care or they can't get an education? And in my mind, the answer is no, that's not good for us as a country or as a society in general. And so I think Africa does really it is really important to the world, and we should think of it that way. And then I show people, look, for $600 on average, you can do a complicated surgery in Africa. A C-section in most of our places in Uganda is less than $250. Imagine that cost in the US and how far the money goes. And at the same time, you're not just helping that woman get a necessary C-section. You're training new physicians to be able to do more C-sections. You're building the infrastructure necessary so that more women can actually get to a place where they can get qualified and competent help. You're building up a system that will actually make a big difference. So those investment dollars, relatively small, are having an amplified impact if you do them in the right places with the right organizations. And so to me, that's the story we try to help people see. Some people are absolutely totally bought into it. I'm sure the same thing you found. And then others are like, yeah, okay, but I'd rather support the Metropolitan Opera in the city. That's a choice you got to make. We try to help people see this is really from the ROI standpoint. It's hard to beat it. And that's why we really want you to think about investing in what we're doing.
Yeah. I appreciate that you detailed out some of the prices. As you know, I just returned from Thailand and I was floored. It's hard for me to even want to spend any money in the US now that I'm back here because I went out to dinner this week with family and I was like, what we just spent on this one dinner for 4 people would be as much as I'd pay for groceries for a month if I were in Thailand. You can walk into a pharmacy. There's a pharmacist who can give you prescriptions, for common ailments right there. And it's going to cost it's the same medication we get in the United States, the exact same, but a fraction of the cost. And it just really floors me. This is a whole other tangent we can go off on, so I'll stop here. But that we can do so much more with our money to help people. And the fact that you're saying 25% of the population, that is no small amount of people. That shows that there needs to be continued investment in education, in healthcare, and helping people feel secure and helping people feel like they have a future. Because when you don't have that, that's why conflicts happen, right? That's why
Absolutely.
things arise, in the world.
Absolutely. And it's also why right now the existing, a lot of people also say, well, isn't this the job of governments should be solving healthcare? And, it's in one level, that's true. But the fact is they're not effective at doing that right now. Part of that is these countries are very poor. When you look at the obstacles, a lot of people say, okay, well, let's just train more people. And I actually spoke to a university class and said, what do you think would happen? Right now, the WHO suggests we're short 6 million health workers in Africa. So what do you think would happen if I found 6 million people and they were all willing to move to Africa tomorrow and become physicians and health workers in Africa? And I said, what would happen is we'd have 5,975,000 unemployed health workers because the system needs to be strengthened. And the issue is just because the people are there, well, do they have the materials they need? Do they have the equipment they need? Do they have a facility, a hospital, or other place they can go and actually use the skills they have? Can the patient afford to access the care? That circle has to be fixed. It's that whole area. And that's how we actually approach our work. We don't think there's one simple, elegant solution like drill water wells. And by the way, I'm not suggesting water wells aren't important, but fixing the healthcare system in a country or in a region like Africa or a country like Kenya, it's a lot more complicated, right? And you have to put the pieces in place in the right order and then help that system get stronger and better. It's a long-term prospect. I think it can be accelerated dramatically. That's why we're doing the work. But even with acceleration, this is a 30-year prospect, not a 5-year. It's not like, I can go to the Gates Foundation and say, give me $1 billion and I'll fix healthcare in Africa. It's going to take a lot of effort and time and energy to really make this happen. And yet it's doable. I really do believe it is. So
Fantastic. What kind of collaborative partners do you have beyond the community partners, the hospitals, on the ground?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty broad array. On the delivery side, there's other organizations that we work closely with. Some of them are universities within the different countries. A good example would be Hope Africa University, which is in Burundi. They actually have a very good medical training program. What we brought to the table was the ability to create an internship program at the hospital, because up before that, people were graduating as what they call medical officers, and they were a doctor. They never had a clinical day in the hospital or anywhere, no practice, no
My
one
gosh.
saying this is how you do this. They just graduated and they were doctors. And so we helped institute the first internship program, working side by side with them. We then also work closely with an organization called PACS, which is the Pan African Academy of Christian Surgeons, who has an outstanding surgical training program. And so they actually do some of the best clinical surgical training, residency training with young surgeons. And so we don't reinvent their wheel. We just come alongside them and say, okay, how do we help you get an institution ready for a training program? How do we help make sure one of the biggest needs in these hospitals is housing? Faculty need a place to live. Many of them have children. If you're an African doctor who wants to be both a teacher and a physician at a hospital, you probably broke the cycle of poverty by going to medical school. You want the same thing for your kids. You need a house for them to live in and develop in. And in most of these rural places in Africa, there is no private rental market or a suitable house, right? So building a house so that the PACS resident can actually, or the faculty or the resident can come and live at the hospital. It's another way we partner. There's also several other organizations that do complementary things like build infrastructure and other aspects. And so what we do is try to come alongside and build networks of everybody who touches things that are adjacent to what we do, or in some places do it more, with greater, they do it more frequently. So we say, you do it there. We'll just, let you handle that. And let's make sure we collaborate and work closely together. And then on the donor side, there's also, that partnership that I think is really critical. As you said, convincing donors that this is something that's worth investing is hard work. I find donors are better at it telling the story sometimes than I can ever tell it, right? And so one of the things we've really invested in is how do we build ambassadors who not just support us, but then are willing to share their networks and their friends. That's actually more valuable to a lot of people than the money, right? So getting them comfortable to say, yeah, I'm not only going to share my resources with AMH, but I'm going to advocate for you and share, access to some of the people that I really think are important in my life. That's another partnership that we look at as we try to really expand our footprint.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. And do you have donor trips where they can go and volunteer, engage, and see everything on the ground?
Yeah, we actually do two things. If they're full-time medical workers, we will collaborate with them in helping them build relationships with specific hospitals. What we have found is the idea of a U.S. doctor just flying in for a week and doing some work isn't very effective. In fact, we often tell people, if that's what you want to do, just donate, go work a week and give the money away that you would have earned for that week to the hospital. You'll be more effective. But if you're interested in a long-term relationship and you're able to spend a couple of weeks to a month each year and go back, now you can have an impact, because now you can build a relationship where you can train, you can be a consultant. People can call you and say, hey, I've got this really complicated case. Can you help me? Can you help me think about it? And so in those cases, we'll help align people with different institutions or hospitals that they have a good alignment with. The second thing we started doing about 3 years ago is what we call donor visioning trips. And there it's to take people that are really interested in understanding our work and have the resources, have, wealth capacity, and giving them a 1 week full immersion in Africa. And what we try to do is make it both fun and, see the beauty that's there, but then also see on the ground the work that's happening and how challenging it is and why it's so important. And so they'll do a safari and then they'll go and visit a hospital and they'll spend the day, really hearing from the people we work with on the ground, why what they're doing is so important and how the support that they get is so valuable. And then in the evening, we'll have one of our people from our office in Nairobi come and share, the aspect that they focus on. So it might be on programming, it might be on, financial viability, it might be on operational strengthening. So they start to hear all the pieces coming together and they get to understand more about us as an organization, but they see the work in action. So we found that to be very, very positive. The people that have gone have found it to be one of those things that in some ways is life changing for them. So we like that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. And I also see the struggle. I've not ever made it to the orphanage that has my Thai family name on it because, there have been times I wanted to go and then I say, well, I could take that money for the flight and everything else and just donate it instead. Or we have different levels of capacity at different times in our lives. I'd love to hear one or two success stories that are your favorite that you love to share with people about an individual or about one of the hospitals or clinics that you work with.
Sure. I
Actually,
could tell 100
yeah.
stories, and I won't. I promise you I won't. Let me just give you two. The first is about a doctor named Tom Katina. Tom is a physician who went to Africa. He was not a surgeon when he first went. He was looking for a place that he could really have a lifetime impact and decided that he needed to become a surgeon to do that. So he studied surgery and actually worked in one of the hospitals in Africa as a surgeon, a clinical surgeon resident to learn even more skills and develop. And then he said, where can I go that is really hard, that I could really make a big impact? And he ended up in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan. Nuba is unique in that it is in this area between North and South Sudan, what is now known as Sudan and South Sudan. And during the civil war between the two, Nuba was actually fighting alongside the South. And when they negotiated a settlement, Nuba ended up in the North. And so the people of Nuba were not loved by their new government. And so then they suffered years of bombardment and, basically war with Sudan. And during that period, Tom had gone and really started this hospital and was the only surgeon for 1 million people. At a time, most of the people evacuated. Tom and three other Sudanese people said, we're staying. And Tom's reasoning was, if I leave, I'm telling the people that live here, my life is more important than their life. And I don't think that's true. And so I'm staying. And so he stayed and he earned just an incredible amount of respect. And even the military on both sides would protect Tom because Tom would treat anybody who was wounded, anyone who needed help, didn't matter. He was there to care for people. Today, that hospital still, New Sudan is now in a new conflict, but that hospital serves 3 million people. It now has a training program. So it went from a humanitarian crisis with basically 4 people to a hospital that this year will see about 8,500 inpatients, about 185,000 people in its outreach clinics, another 85,000 outpatients at the main hospital. It's got a class of about 40 people maybe almost 50 people actually, between midwives and clinical officers. And it's actually transformational for that region. It's the main employer. It is the place where everyone comes for care. And so while there's still an enormous amount to do, and we provide almost 80% of the financial support to keep the hospital open, it's one of our largest projects. Without Tom, and without the people that he's helped develop there, the people in that region would have nothing. They would have no care whatsoever. And so to me, that's just a great example of a person. On a patient side, I will just quickly tell you, I was in a place called Kapsuar a couple of years ago with one of the favorite doctor I mentioned, Dr. Rhodes and his wife. And Dr. Rhodes was doing surgery, and he's funny because he'll just talk to you like you and I are having a conversation while he's doing surgery. He's like, doing skin grafts and doing stuff, and he's just talking. And this young girl came in. He had a young girl in there who was about 11 years old. When she was 4, she fell into a fire and she had a contraction disease, which basically meant that her foot, if you can imagine, was straight up her shin. So her toes could touch her shin because the tendons and all the ligaments had contracted such. So she walked on the back of her foot. Someone had given her a pair of high top tennis shoes, Converse tennis shoes, red. I remember that she was walking around in with her toes stuck. And she was that day getting that contraction release. So she had lived 7 years with something that was absolutely curable. If that burn had been treated properly when she was burned, it never would have happened. If she had been able to see Bill, a year after it, this could have been relieved. Instead, she lived for 7 years as a young child. Think about it, in a very formative time period, right? Not able to run or walk like normal kids. And that day, Bill released the contraction, had her come back a couple weeks later so he could do the plastic surgery to do all the repair. And, today she runs around like a 12-year-old, 13-year-old girl that she is. Again, what a amazing life-changing story. And, we paid for that surgery. We helped Bill build the actual operating capacity at the hospital. And for relatively small investments, she's one example of literally thousands of people's lives that are changed, every day. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. And you'd have a lot of stories to share, but I'm glad you were able to pick two out immediately that show really what impact you make, and very different stories, but both equally important. I would like to see what piece of advice you have for somebody who is looking to make a difference in the lives of others. Maybe they don't know what their passion area is. How do they find that, and where do they start?
yeah, so I think we all have different, as you say, different passions. So discovery is the right word. And in my mind, I think of a couple things. I think, don't let part of my career, part of the reason I'd say I stayed in corporate as long as I did was, I got comfortable. I felt really good and safe and effective at what I was doing. And I think, in some ways, I deprived myself from earlier in my career moving into something that I now find to be much more rewarding and fulfilling. And so, not allowing yourself to be afraid in some sense, not letting yourself, let fear dictate to you that, I can't do that, or I really need to stay here where it's safe. I would, strongly suggest people just measure that, think about it. I think the other thing is, don't underestimate the impact you can have. The skills you have, the personal experiences you have can count a lot in a lot of different ways and can be used in so many ways to make the lives of people and organizations better. And then the third thing I've learned is really have a center of or a core sense of what's the mission on a personal level and then on an organizational level. Why do I exist? What is it that motivates me today? Why does this organization exist? What are we about? Do I really understand that? I do now for me. I mean, for me as a person and for our organization, I feel really strongly that I know what we're about. I know what I'm about, but that wasn't always the case. And so really pushing myself to understand and really feel like I was in that place, it was hard work, but it made a big difference. So those are three things that come to mind that I would just suggest for people. So
Fantastic. We are going to, of course, put the link to AfricanMissionHealthcare.com into the show notes so that everybody can find you, learn more about you, make donations, and get involved in the organization. My last question to all of my guests is always, do you have a favorite quote, verse, family motto, mantra, just words that help you get through every day and keep you inspired?
yeah, so for me, I like to think about the fact that I am so fortunate, so blessed. I come from a Christian tradition. And for me, the fact that I'm called to actually care for the least of these, for the people that just for whatever reason, whether it's because of where they were born, because they live in an environment where they're, oppressed, that I feel this calling to, help those people that are much less fortunate than I am. And so, the love for the least of these, the idea of caring for the least of these, for me, that's not just an option, it's a command. And I find that when I do it, it not only feels like it's the right thing to do, but it really feels good, right? That I feel like I am adding value that really has a tangible, lasting impact. And so for me, that's, something that motivates me every day.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, Scott. This has been a really inspiring conversation. I feel like I'm in so much alignment with where I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'm just really grateful that I can help share your message today.
Well, Annika, thank you. It's been a pleasure meeting you. And like I said, I'm glad I learned a little bit about your work in Ghana. I'd love to hear more. And if you want to come to Africa, I can certainly help you combine a
Okay.
trip to Ghana with some other places.
We're
So
going to do that.
anytime.
We're going
All
to do
right.
that. Absolutely. Thank you to everybody who's watching or listening to this episode of Your Brand Amplified. And I'll be back again with another amazing guest to share their journey, their story, some actionable tips and things for you to think about to make your life a little bit better every day. Thanks for listening or watching to this episode of Your Brand Amplified. Don't forget to leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast listening platform. And if you want to learn more, check us out at yourbrandamplified.com.